For Ultramar! Take this heretic! You will not escape! The Emperor protects.
What if the most dangerous army in history just accidentally invaded the wrong galaxy? Today we're witnessing the ultimate clash of titans. The Warhammer 40K Imperium versus the Star Wars Republic. I've been obsessed with this crossover for weeks. And trust me, you are not ready for how these two worlds collide. Grab a snack, get comfy, and let's see who actually runs this galaxy. You cannot miss how this ends.
The ritual had no name in any Sith text that Darth Sidious had studied. It existed in fragments, partial inscriptions carved into Exegol's bedrock in a script that predated the Old Republic by 40,000 years. Geometric patterns that the Rakutans had copied from something older still. Mathematical sequences that described the relationship between consciousness and dimensional space in terms that modern force theory had no framework to accommodate. Sidious had spent 11 years reconstructing it. He had done so with the patience of someone who understood that the greatest power was never found quickly, that the dark side rewarded those who could treat centuries as acceptable timelines for ambition. He had built his Sith Eternal infrastructure on Exegol around the ritual site with the specific intention of having sufficient resources available when the moment arrived. The moment arrived on a day that would have no name in any surviving historical record. He stood in the ritual chamber 3 kilometers beneath Exegol's surface, surrounded by 47 Sith cultists, whose primary function was to amplify his force signature into the geometric patterns carved into the floor, ceiling, and walls around him. The chamber was cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The cold of a place where the force moved in directions it was not supposed to move, channeled by geometries that treated causality as a suggestion rather than a law. The other galaxy, Sidious said quietly, reading from the central inscription. The translation had taken 3 years and was still partial in places he found irritating. Psychic beings beyond the Force. Entities that feed on emotion. He had interpreted this as a description of a power source. A reservoir of dark side energy so vast and so alien that even the Sith had never fully accessed it. Something that existed in a dimensional adjacency to the galaxy he inhabited, separated by barriers that the Rakutans had learned to thin and that he had now learned to breach. He began the ritual. The 47 cultists died in the 3rd minute, which was expected. The ritual required their life force as fuel, and Sidious had selected them for this specific purpose rather than any ongoing loyalty. Their deaths fed the geometric patterns, which fed the force channeling, which fed the dimensional thinning that he could feel beginning in the space above the chamber's center. The thinning became fracture. The fracture became something he did not have a word for. Not a tier, not a portal. A reorganization of the boundary between one reality and another, as if space itself were paper, and someone had decided that 2 separate sheets could occupy the same position without consequence. Sidious felt it open, and felt something come through it that was not the dark side reservoir he had anticipated. It was older, angrier, more deliberate. It carried the weight of billions of minds compressed into a single psychic pressure that pushed against the force the way a tide pushed against a seawall. Not trying to destroy it, not aware enough to try. Simply moving in the direction it had always moved and encountering an obstacle it had never encountered before. For exactly 4 seconds, Darth Sidious felt genuine fear. Then the fracture stabilized, collapsed to a controlled dimensional scar rather than a full breach, and the pressure receded to something distant and muffled. And across the Star Wars galaxy, at 17 separate points in space chosen by the physics of dimensional fracture rather than any intent, pieces of something else arrived. The sensors aboard the Republic cruiser Fortitude registered the anomaly at 0340 hours during what should have been a routine patrol of the Coruscant outer approach corridors. Captain Fen Ralk had been commanding Republic vessels for 19 years, which meant he had developed the specific quality of professional calm that came from having survived enough unexpected situations to stop treating unexpected as synonymous with dangerous. That quality lasted approximately 40 seconds after his sensor officer's first report. "Sir," Lieutenant Voss said, with the specific flatness of someone whose training was fighting their instincts for control of their voice, "I'm reading mass transit emergence signatures. Multiple points. The signatures do not match any known hyperspace transit profile." Ralk moved to the sensor station. "Clarify." "They're not coming out of hyperspace," Voss said. "They're just appearing. Like hyperspace transit, but the dimensional mathematics are wrong. Completely wrong." Whatever these vessels used to get here, it wasn't a hyperdrive. On the sensor display, 17 separate emergence points painted themselves across the outer approach corridor in a pattern that had no tactical logic Rolk could identify. Not an attack formation, not a defensive spread, not a patrol route. Random, as if something had been scattered rather than deployed. Fleet composition? Rolk asked. Voss worked through the analysis for 30 seconds that felt considerably longer. Unknown. Hull configurations don't match any registered design database. Weapon signatures are, sir, I'm reading mass driver technology, kinetic projectile weapons, and energy signatures that I can't classify. Whatever drives these ships, it's not a repulsor lift system and it's not a standard ion drive. Rolk looked at the sensor display. 17 emergence points, dozens of vessels at each point, hundreds of ships in total, representing a combined tonnage that his tactical systems calculated and then flagged as potentially erroneous because the numbers were implausible. Get me a channel to Coruscant Command, he said, Priority 1, and hold all fire until we have a clear picture of what we're dealing with. He looked at the largest emergence point, where his sensors were resolving the silhouettes of vessels that were simultaneously unfamiliar in every design detail and unmistakably, despite everything, built for war. Someone, he said quietly, needs to tell the Jedi Council. Master Yoda felt it before any sensor array registered anything. He was meditating in the temple's high garden when the Force did something it had not done in the 900 years of his experience. It moved sideways. Not the expected flow of light and dark, connection and severance, life in its absence, sideways. In a direction he did not have terminology for, towards something that the Force recognized with the specific quality of recognizing a distant relative, similar in structure, related in origin, but developed along entirely different principles for entirely different purposes. He opened his eyes. Troubled, the Force is, he said, to the empty garden. Something has arrived. Something that should not exist here. And yet he paused, reaching out with senses that 9 centuries had refined to extraordinary sensitivity. Familiar it feels. Not the same, but kin, his comm activated. Master Yoda. Mace Windu's voice carried the controlled tension of a man delivering information he had not yet fully processed. You need to come to the Situation Room. We have a developing situation in the outer approach corridors. On my way, Yoda said. Then quietly to the garden, patient we must be. Hasty responses to unknown arrivals. The beginning of many wars, that has been. The first Space Marine that clone troopers encountered was Sergeant Decimus of the Ultramarines 3rd Company, who had been conducting a survey of the emergence point's immediate spatial environment when a Republic patrol fighter came within visual range. The encounter lasted 11 minutes. It did not result in violence, which was a significant achievement, given that both sides had weapons aimed at each other for 9 of those 11 minutes. What prevented violence was something neither side had anticipated: curiosity. The clone trooper pilot, a veteran named CT-7734, who went by the name Bar, found himself staring at a figure in blue and gold armor through his cockpit viewport, and experiencing the specific cognitive dissonance of seeing something that his every tactical instinct classified as a threat, while some other part of his mind insisted on noting that the figure had human proportions, human posture, and was standing with the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to fire and wanted that decision to be legible. Bar kept his weapons armed. He also kept the channel open. Unknown contact he transmitted on all frequencies. Identify yourself. The figure looked at his fighter. Its helmet turned with the deliberate quality of something that was deciding how to respond rather than whether to respond. Then it reached up and removed the helmet entirely, revealing a human face, young-looking, dark-skinned, with the kind of controlled expression that came from military training of a specific and serious variety. Sergeant Decimus, the figure said, its voice carrying through the vacuum by means of equipment Bar couldn't identify. Ultramarines 3rd Company, Lord Guilliman's Legion. A pause. We did not come here intentionally. We are attempting to understand what has happened. We request. He seemed to search for appropriate phrasing. We request that you not fire while we figure it out. Bar stared at the face in the viewport. Are you human, he asked. Yes, Decimus said. Though I suspect your definition of human and mine may have some technical differences. Bar transmitted this exchange to the Fortitude. The Fortitude transmitted it to Coruscant Command. Coruscant Command transmitted it to the Jedi Temple. And 3 hours later, in a conference room aboard the Fortitude that felt simultaneously too small and inadequately fortified for what it contained, the first formal meeting between Republic leadership and Primarch representation took place. Roboute Guilliman arrived without escort. This was a deliberate choice that he had spent 40 minutes arguing Horace and Lionel Johnson into accepting. If we arrive with a military escort, he had explained, with the patient precision that was his defining characteristic, we are telling them that we do not trust them. If we arrive without one, we are telling them that we are not afraid of them. These are not the same message. The second is significantly more useful. It is also significantly more dangerous, Lionel Johnson had replied, with the flat quality that meant his paranoia had already mapped 17 ways the meeting could be an assassination setup. Yes, Guilliman agreed. That is why I am going and not you. He entered the conference room alone and spent the first 30 seconds simply looking at the people arrayed across the table from him. A Jedi Master whose force presence registered in his limited psychic awareness as something enormous and ancient. A human Jedi in his 30s with the look of someone carrying more weight than his face showed. A Republic Admiral whose tactical assessment was obvious in the way his eyes moved. And a protocol droid whose presence suggested someone had translation might be necessary. Lord Guilliman, the older Jedi said, Master Windu, he had been told. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Thank you for proposing it rather than opening fire, Guilliman replied. That response showed more discipline than I would have expected from a military organization encountering unknown fleet elements at their home system's approach. We've had experience with unknown fleet elements, Windu said. The first response is usually catastrophic. We try to improve on that when possible. A philosophy I share, Guilliman said. He sat down across from them, which put him at eye level rather than forcing them to look up at his standing height. Another deliberate choice. I will be direct with you because I believe directness is more valuable than diplomacy at this stage of our acquaintance, and because I suspect you are people who will respect it more than you would respect careful political language. Windu's expression shifted fractionally towards something that might have been approval. Go ahead. We do not know how we came to be in your galaxy, Guilliman said. We were conducting standard military operations in our own space when something pulled us through what our scientists are describing as a dimensional fracture. We have lost contact with our home systems. We cannot navigate by our normal stellar references because this galaxy's star charts do not match ours. We are, in the most straightforward possible terms, lost. And your immediate intentions? Obi-Wan Kenobi asked, from Windu's right. To understand what has happened, Guilliman said. To establish stable position for our fleets and personnel, to make contact with this galaxy's political structures and determine whether coexistence is possible. He paused. And to prevent the 3 warships that broke formation during our transit from doing anything that creates a conflict neither side can easily walk back. Windu's eyes sharpened. Which 3? My brother Lion's vessel has positioned itself in a targeting solution for your closest orbital platform, Guilliman said. This is not aggression, it is anxiety expressed through tactical preparation. He will not fire unless fired upon or unless he perceives an imminent threat. However, Guilliman's expression conveyed something that was not quite apology but occupied adjacent territory. His definition of imminent threat is somewhat more expansive than most. We have a similar problem with some of our own people, Kenobi said quietly. What would help? Tell your ships to move away from his targeting solution, Guilliman said. Not retreat, repositioning, give him room. People who grew up under genuine threat respond poorly to proximity they cannot control. The response looks like aggression but is actually fear. Kenobi looked at Windu. Some communication passed between them that required no words. We can do that, Windu said. Outside the conference room, the situation was deteriorating. The Republic cruiser Adamant had moved into a flanking position relative to the Ultramarines vessels, for defensive reasons that its captain considered entirely reasonable. 3 Space Marine boarding pods had deployed in response, for defensive reasons that their company captain considered entirely reasonable. 2 Jedi Vectors had intercepted the boarding pods, for defensive reasons that the pilots considered entirely reasonable. Everyone was being entirely reasonable, and the situation was 40 seconds from becoming catastrophic. It became catastrophic when a Republic gunship opened fire on a Space Marine Thunderhawk that had come within what its pilot calculated as an unacceptably threatening range. The Thunderhawk returned fire, the Fortitude's alarms activated. In the conference room, Guilliman's expression did not change, but he closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds in the manner of someone counting to a number insufficient for the occasion. Then something else happened. 3 Eta-2 Actis-class interceptors appeared from a vector that none of the Republic vessels had been covering, not Coruscant's approach, but the diplomatic dead zone between the 2 fleets where nothing should have been operating. They fired on the Thunderhawk with precision that damaged its engines without destroying it, then immediately fired on the Republic gunship with the same precision, and then broadcast on every frequency simultaneously. Both sides said a voice that no one recognized, "Will stand down." Immediately. In the conference room, Kenobi's head tilted slightly. "That's not one of ours," he said. "No," Guilliman agreed. He had opened his eyes. "It is not one of mine either." The three interceptors held position between the fleets, and on the sensor displays, every weapons system on every vessel tracked them and found no targeting solution because they kept moving, not evasively, just continuously. The specific movement pattern of something that had no intention of being a stationary target. Then they transmitted again, this time on a narrow beam directed at the Fortitude only. "I would like to know," the voice said, with the specific quality of controlled danger, "which political structure in this galaxy is responsible for the separatist attack formations currently emerging from the inner system. Because they are not mine and they are not yours, and someone sent them." Windu looked at the sensor display. 16 separatist vessels had entered the outer approach corridor from the opposite direction, moving with tactical precision that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. They were targeting both the Republic ships and the unknown Imperium vessels. Both sides were being attacked simultaneously. Someone, Kenobi said quietly, wanted this meeting to fail. In the conference room, Guilliman stood. He was tall enough that the movement reclaimed a spatial presence that his deliberate sitting had been designed to minimize, and everyone in the room recalibrated accordingly. "Do not make us regret restraint," he said, to the room and to whatever was listening beyond it. "We came here without knowing where we were going. We have not fired on your vessels. We have not taken territory. We have not made demands. We have sat at a table and spoken honestly with people we do not know." His voice carried the weight of someone who had built empires by being precisely clear about what they would and would not accept. If someone in this galaxy has decided that our presence is a problem to be eliminated rather than a situation to be understood, they have made a serious miscalculation about what the Legiones Astartes consider acceptable provocation. Windu looked at him steadily. "What do you need?" Guilliman looked at the sensor display, at the separatist fleet, at the unknown interceptors holding position between the fleets, at his own vessels disciplined enough not to have opened fire despite every reason to. "I need to know who sent those ships," he said. "And I need 10 minutes to get a message to my brother before he decides that the appropriate response to an ambush is to remove everything within weapons range." 10 minutes, Windu said. He was already moving. "You have 8. The 8 minutes produced 7 decisions that would shape the next decade of galactic history. Guilliman's message to Lionel Johnson was direct and contained no diplomatic softening, because Lionel Johnson responded poorly to diplomatic softening at the best of times and catastrophically to it under tactical pressure. "Hold position. Do not fire. The attack came from a third party. We are being manipulated." Lion's response came back in 40 seconds. "I know. I identified the third party's coordination frequency 12 minutes ago. Sending data." The data arrived. Guilliman read it. Then he read it again, because the first reading had produced implications he wanted to verify before accepting. The separatist attack had been coordinated through a command frequency that Guilliman's signal analysts, working from first principles on technology they had encountered less than 6 hours ago, had traced to a point source that was neither the separatist vessels nor any Republic installation in the outer approach corridor. It came from Coruscant. From deep within Coruscant, from a location that Guilliman's analysts could pinpoint to a specific district, but not a specific structure. Transmitted through 17 relay points that had been designed to obscure origin rather than facilitate communication. Someone on the Republic's capital world had sent 16 warships to destroy a diplomatic meeting between the Republic and an unknown extragalactic power. Guilliman forwarded the data to the Fortitude's conference room without comment, because the data was eloquent without assistance. Mace Windu read it in the specific silence of someone whose existing suspicions had just been confirmed in a direction they had been hoping to avoid. "Chancellor Palpatine will want to be briefed," he said, to no one in particular. "Yes," Kenobi replied, with an inflection that carried more information than the word itself. Guilliman watched this exchange with the analytical attention he applied to everything, and filed the specific quality of Kenobi's "yes" for later examination. He had learned over decades of building an empire from contested worlds and fractious commanders that the most important data in any negotiation was rarely what people said. It was what they almost said and decided against. The second decision was made by the unknown interceptors. They transmitted a navigation coordinate to the Fortitude and to the Ultramarines flagship simultaneously, then executed a hyperspace jump that lasted exactly 4 minutes before they returned to the coordinate they had specified. The coordinate was a dead zone in the outer approach corridor, a region of space with no natural features and no tactical value, chosen for the specific quality of being somewhere that no one had any reason to be watching. When the Republic Ultramarines vessels arrived, cautiously with weapons ready but not charged, they found a single ship already waiting. It was not a Separatist vessel. It was not a Republic cruiser. It was a modified freighter that had been rebuilt so many times its original class was unidentifiable, equipped with sensor-dampening technology that explained why it had appeared in the dead zone without anyone detecting its approach. The ramp lowered. A man descended it who was simultaneously exactly what he appeared to be and impossible to fully read. He had the build and movement of someone who had spent significant portions of his life in situations where being difficult to kill was a professional requirement. He wore no military insignia. He carried identification documents that Guilliman's analysts would spend 3 days verifying and still not be entirely certain about. His name, he said, was Bail Organa. "Senator?" Kenobi said, with the warm relief of someone encountering an expected ally in an unexpected location. "Obi-Wan." Organa looked at the Ultramarines officers present, at the Space Marines standing at parade rest with the specific stillness that made them look like statues until they moved. "You're the Primarchs people." "We serve Lord Guilliman," the senior officer confirmed. "Are you the pilot of those interceptors?" "No," Organa said, "but I can reach them. The question is whether we're going to have a conversation worth having before whoever sent the Separatist fleet tries something more direct." "Who sent the fleet?" Windu asked. "That," Organa said, "is the conversation worth having. They had it aboard the modified freighter, which was cramped and smelled of machine oil and 3 different kinds of food that no one had time to identify, and which was the most secure location available because it was the only vessel present with no connection to any communication network that could be monitored." Organa explained what he knew in the precise, organized manner of someone who had been waiting for a moment when the explanation would be both safe and productive. The Clone Wars were not what they appeared to be. Both sides, the Republic and the Confederacy of Independent Systems, had been engineered from the beginning by a single intelligence that understood political manipulation well enough to manufacture a crisis from sufficient scale to justify whatever emergency measures it needed. The Jedi had suspected this. They had not been able to prove it. The manipulation operated at a level sophisticated enough to leave no direct evidence, only patterns that were suggestive rather than conclusive, and that could always be explained by alternative interpretations. Until now, Organa said. He pulled up a holographic display showing signal intercepts, financial flows, command structure analyses. The interceptors who broke up the engagement outside had been tracking that coordination frequency for 6 months. They traced it to the same source you did. He looked at Guilliman directly. "Your signal analysts are remarkably good for people who've never encountered our technology before." "We have had practice analyzing hostile communications under pressure," Guilliman said. "The specific technology changes. The mathematical principles underlying signal analysis do not." "Fair point." Organa expanded the holographic display. "The signal originates from a network we've been mapping for 2 years. It doesn't belong to the Separatists. It doesn't belong to the Republic military. It's a third structure parallel to both, with access to resources that shouldn't be available to any private organization." "Who controls it?" Kenobi asked, though his tone suggested he had already considered and rejected several possible answers. "We don't have a definitive identification," Organa said. "But the network's operational center is in the Senate district. High levels of Senate access, possibly Senate leadership." He paused, "possibly higher." The silence that followed had a specific quality. Guilliman broke it. "In my experience," he said, "when an investigation traces manipulation to the highest levels of a political structure and then stops because going further requires implicating the structure itself, one of 2 things has happened. Either the investigation has been deliberately limited to avoid an uncomfortable conclusion, or the conclusion is so dangerous that the people who found it are afraid of what comes next." Organa looked at him steadily. "Both," he said. "Then," Guilliman said, "you need people who have no stake in your political structure's survival. People who can follow the evidence to its conclusion without worrying about what it costs." "Is that an offer?" Windu asked. "It is an observation," Guilliman said. "Whether it becomes an offer depends on what we discover about who sent 16 warships to prevent this conversation. On the Ultramarines' flagship, Macrage's Honor Horace Lupercal was driving Rogel Dorn to the edge of his considerable patience. "You should be in the tactical room," Dorn said, for the third time. "Guilliman has the tactical room," Horace replied, studying the star charts of this new galaxy with the specific intensity of someone who learned the shape of places by looking at them rather than reading data about them. "Guilliman handles politics better than I do. I handle people better than Guilliman does. We are having a political meeting. Therefore, Guilliman should be at the meeting, and I should be here, learning the shape of this galaxy, so that when the political meeting ends and we need to understand our military position, I will have something useful to contribute." Dorn considered this argument. "That is not your actual reason." "No," Horace agreed. "My actual reason is that if I attend the meeting, I will say something that makes everyone like me, and then Guilliman will spend an hour undoing the damage because people who like me tend to expect things from me that I then have to disappoint." He looked at the star charts. "I do better work from a distance." This was not entirely true, and they both knew it, but it was true enough that Dorn let it stand. What was actually true was that Horace Lupercal was unsettled in a way he had not been since his early campaigns, and that the unsettlement had a shape he could not fully articulate. This galaxy felt wrong in the specific way that home felt wrong when you returned after a long absence and found that it had continued existing without you, familiar in structure, alien in atmosphere, carrying the weight of a history you had not been part of. He had felt since arriving the persistent low-level awareness that something in this place was watching him, not with the blunt pressure of warp entities, which he had encountered and which felt like being looked at by something enormous and uncaring. This was different, specific, personal. The feeling of being recognized by something that should not know who he was. "The Force," he said. Dorn looked at him. "The Jedi's power, something connected to it, or adjacent to it." Horace turned from the star charts. "The Jedi sense it. They experience it as a spiritual current. Our Psychers would experience it differently. They would feel its edges, the places where it interfaces with the warp." He paused. "I am neither a Jedi nor a Psyker, but I can feel it. In this galaxy, whatever generates the Force is aware of us, is aware of me specifically." "That could be chaos," Dorn said. "No," Horace said, with the certainty of someone who had enough experience with chaos influences to distinguish them by texture. "Chaos feels like hunger. This feels like curiosity. Like something ancient that has seen a pattern it recognizes and is wondering whether the recognition is accurate." "And is it?" Dorn asked. "Accurate?" Horace looked at the star charts again. "I don't know. That's what concerns me." His comm activated. "Lord Horace," said the communication officer, "we're receiving a transmission from an unregistered vessel requesting a private meeting. Authentication code validates as a pause. As the same code that Sergeant Decimus's patrol recorded from the unknown interceptors in the approach corridor." Horace and Dorn exchanged looks. "Accept," Horace said. The transmission resolved into a face that Horace had not expected. Young, mid-20s, with the look of someone who had grown up making difficult choices and had gotten very good at it. Brown hair, the kind of build that came from training rather than augmentation, and eyes that were doing something unusual. They were looking at Horace with the specific quality of someone who recognized him from a description rather than experience, and was finding the reality more complicated than the description. "Lord Horace Lupercal," the young man said. "I'm told you're the one I need to talk to about military cooperation between our forces." "I am," Horace said. "Who are you?" "Anakin Skywalker," he said. "J.D. Knight, General in the Grand Army of the Republic." He paused. "And according to the Jedi Council, the person least likely to start a war by accident in a first contact situation. A beat. They're probably wrong about that, but here we are." Horace looked at him for a long moment. Then something happened that Dorn would describe later as one of the most unexpected things he had witnessed in 4 decades of war. Horace Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, laughed. Not the controlled political warmth that he deployed in diplomatic contexts. A genuine laugh, short and surprised, the sound of someone encountering an unexpected thing that delighted them. "Here we are," Horace agreed. "Sit down, Anakin Skywalker. Tell me about this war you're fighting." 3 systems away, in a region of space that the new galaxy's charts designated as the Outer Rim, Lionel Johnson was having a different kind of first contact. He had not attended the diplomatic meeting. He had sent a representative, as agreed. He had then spent the time the meeting occupied doing what Lionel Johnson did when he was not required to be visible. He disappeared into the operational background of his fleet's sensor network and started mapping everything. The third party's coordination frequency was 1 thread. He had found 11 more. They formed a network that was simultaneously sophisticated enough to suggest substantial resources and crude enough to suggest that its architect had never expected it to be analyzed by someone who approached signal intelligence the way Lion approached everything, as a puzzle that had a solution, and that the solution's existence was a moral affront to the problem's continued presence. He traced 6 of the 11 threads before the meeting ended. The 7th was different. It was newer, more sophisticated in its obfuscation, as if whoever had built it had learned from the vulnerabilities in the other 6. It had been established recently. His analyst estimated within the past 48 hours. It had been established in direct response to the Imperium's arrival. Someone in this galaxy had seen them coming through the dimensional fracture and immediately begun building new communication infrastructure. Not military infrastructure, not political infrastructure, shadow infrastructure, the kind built by people who operated in the space between official power and unofficial reality. That infrastructure was currently carrying a single message, repeated on a 17-second interval, addressed to an encrypted recipient designation that Lion had not yet broken. The message was in a language his translation systems couldn't parse, but the mathematical structure underneath the language was universal enough that his analysts could identify its type, if not its content. It was an offer. Someone was offering something to someone, with the specific urgency of an offer that had a limited window. Lion stared at the intercept for 30 seconds. "Record and continue monitoring," he said, "and begin decryption on the recipient designation. I want to know who is receiving this offer before I decide whether I need to know what the offer contains." "My lord," his intelligence officer said, "if we break the encryption, they'll know we broke it. We'll lose the intercept." "Yes," Lion said, "which means we need to decide what's more valuable, knowing who they are or knowing what they're saying." He considered, knowing who they are. If we know who they are, we can find other ways to learn what they're saying. The intelligence officer began the decryption work. Lion watched the intercept repeat and thought about the dimensional fracture that had brought them here. About the timing, the fracture had not been natural. His scientists had concluded that within hours of arrival, it had been generated by something in this galaxy, using principles that overlapped with but were not identical to warp mechanics. Something had reached into the Imperium's space and pulled them through. The question that Lion had been turning over since that conclusion arrived was one that his brothers had not yet asked because they were still in the phase of responding to the immediate situation rather than questioning its foundation. Why had they been pulled? Not how, not whether the pulling could be reversed. Why? What did this galaxy's version of the warp, this force that the Jedi spoke of with the specific reverence of people who understood they were connected to something vastly larger than themselves? What did it want with 12 Primarchs and the remnants of the early Imperium? What purpose did they serve in a galaxy that had been operating without them for its entire history? The intelligence officer's console chimed. "My lord," she said, with the specific flatness of someone delivering information whose implications she had not yet fully processed, "I have a partial decryption on the recipient designation. Show me." The partial decryption was sufficient to identify the message's intended recipient with a confidence level Lion considered adequate for action. He looked at the name for a long time. Then he transmitted a priority message to Guilliman, marked for the Primarch's eyes only, containing 3 words and the decryption data: Sidious, Horus. Now, the conversation between Horus Lupercal and Anakin Skywalker lasted 4 hours, which was 3 hours and 40 minutes longer than anyone on either side had anticipated. It covered ground that neither of them had expected to cover, not just the Clone Wars and the Imperium situation, but the shape of their respective histories, what it felt like to be made for war, what it cost to be responsible for the lives of thousands of soldiers who had been trained to follow you into conditions that would kill normal men, what it meant to serve a larger vision that you had not created and sometimes questioned. Anakin Skywalker talked about the Jedi Order with the specific ambivalence of someone who had been raised by an institution they loved and found inadequate simultaneously. About attachment. About the way the Order's prohibition on personal connection created in its practitioners a particular kind of loneliness that the Order itself refused to acknowledge. Horus listened with the quality of attention that had always been his greatest asset, not performing interest, genuinely having it. He listened the way he had always listened, with the part of him that understood people by finding the shape of their pain rather than the content of their arguments. The Jedi forbid attachment because attachment creates vulnerability, Horus said, when Anakin had finished a particular thought. Because they believe that if you care about specific people, you can be compromised through those people, manipulated through them. That's the theory, Anakin said. The flaw in the theory, Horus said, is that the alternative, caring about nothing specific, only principles and ideas, produces people who can commit atrocities in defense of principles they love. It is easier to do terrible things for ideals than for people. People are complicated and particular and real. Ideals are abstract enough to survive any evidence. Anakin was quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought about it that way, he said. Someone manipulating a Jedi, Horus continued, with the specific quality of someone thinking aloud rather than lecturing, would not attack their principles. Their principles are too well defended. They would find the specific person the Jedi loves in the way they are not supposed to love, and they would create a situation where the Jedi must choose between their principles and that person. He said this without specific intent. He did not know about Padme. He did not know about the nightmares. He did not know about the Chancellor's private conversations with a specific Jedi Knight who had been told his attachment was a weakness rather than being taught how to carry it. But Anakin Skywalker's response to those words was visible in the specific quality of stillness that came over him. The stillness of someone who has heard a thing articulated that they have been living without being able to name. You sound like you've seen this before, Anakin said carefully. I have seen what corruption looks like in people who are good, Horus said. In my experience, it does not begin with the decision to do evil. It begins with the decision to do one small wrong thing for a large right reason, and that decision creates a precedent. And the precedent creates the next decision. And eventually, the person cannot identify where the line was because they crossed it in a direction they believed was correct. He paused. The most dangerous thing, he said, is not malice. Malice is recognizable. The most dangerous thing is good intentions corrupted by fear. Anakin looked at him with an expression that Horus filed as recognition, complicated, not entirely comfortable. Horus's calm signaled. He glanced at it. Guilliman's priority message, 3 words and data. He read the data. He kept his expression neutral with the practiced quality of someone who had been reading devastating intelligence in front of people and reacting to it in private for 40 years. I'm sorry, he said to Anakin Skywalker. Something requires my immediate attention. I would like to continue this conversation. So would I, Anakin said. They would continue it. But not before Horus spent 3 hours with Guilliman and Lionel Johnson looking at signal intercept data that told them someone in this galaxy had sent a message specifically to Horus Lupercal through 17 relay points containing an offer that the decryption now rendered in full clarity. The War Master of the Imperium is wasted serving a galaxy that did not make him. We have much to discuss. The future belongs to those who understand what power actually requires. Horus read it twice. Then he set it down on the table in front of Guilliman and Lion and said with perfect calm, well, that answers the question of whether we've been noticed. It answers more than that, Guilliman said. It tells us that whoever sent this knows who you are, knows your title, knows your reputation. He looked at his brother steadily. They researched you before they reached out, which means they have a source of information about us that we have not identified. It also tells us, Lion said, from the corner where he had positioned himself in the specific way he positioned himself when he wanted to see everyone in the room without having his own back exposed, what they want. They want you. He looked at Horus directly, not us, not the legions, not the technology or the territory or the political alliance. You specifically. Why? Horus asked, though his expression suggested he already had a theory. Because, Guilliman said quietly, whoever sent this message understands that an army follows a Primarch. That the legions are loyal to their Gene Father first and the Imperium second. And if they have the Gene Father, they have the Legion, Horus finished. The 3 of them sat with this. Outside the flagship's viewports, the Star Wars galaxy continued its existence. Enormous, ancient, full of civilizations that had been building and dying and rebuilding for 100,000 years, currently in the process of consuming itself in a war that seemed to have no natural origin point. We are not going to respond, Horus said finally. Agreed, Guilliman said. We are also, Horus continued, going to proceed as if this message was never received. Because whoever sent it will expect either acceptance or explicit rejection. If we give them neither, they will have to either escalate or reveal more of their position in the attempt to get a response. Lion made a sound that on anyone else would have been a laugh. You have been spending too much time with me. I have been spending exactly the right amount of time with you, Horus replied. You are occasionally useful. For the first time since the dimensional fracture had deposited them in an unfamiliar galaxy with insufficient resources and no clear path home, Something passed between the three brothers that was recognizable as what it was, a moment of being themselves, without performance or politics, simply three people who had been made for impossible work and had found, against all reasonable expectation, that the work was still there. "Send Korax my analysis of the signal network," Horus said. "He will find threads we missed, and tell him." He paused. "Tell him to find us a face for the letters."
Okay, hold up. We just finished second half, and things are officially spiraling. Did you catch that? We just watched a literal Primarch and a Jedi Knight, two icons from completely different universes. Just start comparing war stories. It's wild! But here's my hot take. This isn't just a battle of lasers and bolt guns anymore. It's a psychological chess match. And with the reveal of who's actually pulling the strings, the stakes just went from local skirmish to total galactic collapse. Stay tuned, because the turn coming up is going to change everything. Let's get back into it.
Corvus Corax found the face in 11 days. He did not announce this finding immediately, because Corax had learned over decades of intelligence work that the most valuable piece of information was not the answer itself, but the question the answer generated, and that answering too quickly closed possibilities that remaining uncertain kept open. Instead, he spent 3 days verifying the identification against 7 independent data sources, 2 of which required him to physically access Republic Senate archives through methods that would have created significant diplomatic complications if discovered. He spent another 2 days mapping the network's full structure, which turned out to be considerably more extensive than Lyon's initial 11 threads had suggested. And he spent 6 days doing something that the others would not have anticipated from the Primarch most associated with shadow operations. He watched Sheev Palpatine, Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, conduct his public duties with the specific quality of attention that Corax brought to things he was trying to fully understand before deciding how to respond to them. What he saw was extraordinary, not because Palpatine was extraordinary in his public presentation. He was not. He was warm, measured, politically skilled, carrying the carefully assembled appearance of someone whose primary characteristic was thoughtful concern for the Republic's welfare. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions more than he issued directive. He had the specific quality of a man who understood that appearing to have power was less useful than appearing to facilitate others' power. What was extraordinary was the gap. The gap between the public performance and the private reality was the largest Corax had ever encountered in a political figure, and he had spent 40 years studying political figures, whose public and private selves were studies in contradiction. Even the most sophisticated political operators allowed their real selves to surface occasionally. In moments of stress, in private communication, in the specific relaxation of expression that occurred when someone believed themselves unobserved. Palpatine had no such moments. In 11 days of continuous surveillance, Corax observed nothing, not a flicker of expression, not a word in private that contradicted the public persona, not a single instance of the mask slipping that was inconsistent with the performance, which meant one of 2 things. Either Palpatine was genuinely what he appeared to be, and the signal network was connected to him through intermediaries rather than directly, and Corax's identification was wrong, or Palpatine was so thoroughly his performance that there was nothing left behind it, that the mask had been worn so long it had become the face, that whatever he had been before the performance began had been entirely consumed by what he had chosen to become. Corax had encountered this before in a different context. He had encountered it in certain Space Marine veterans who had spent too long in combat theaters where survival required becoming the predator rather than the soldier, where the person and the function had merged past the point of separation. The difference was that veterans who lost themselves in combat were dangerous to enemies. Palpatine, Corax understood, was dangerous to everyone. He transmitted his full report to Guilliman on the 12th day, attached to a note that read, "He knows we're looking. He has known since day 4. He is letting us look because he believes what we find will tell us less about him than we think. He may be correct, but I know something he doesn't know." I know Guilliman's response came in under a minute. "What?" Corax's answer. "Where he's going tonight. Alone." The chamber beneath the Senate district was not in any architectural record of Coruscant. It had been excavated across 40 years by methods that left no trace in the planet's geological record, using technology that Corax did not recognize, but that his analyst tentatively identified as derived from the same Rakatan ruin framework that had produced the dimensional fracture. The chamber was circular, lined with geometric patterns that were not quite the same as the ones Guilliman's team had found evidence of at the anomaly's origin point, but shared enough structural vocabulary to be recognizable as related. It smelled of ozone and something older that Corax could not identify. He had arrived 4 hours before Palpatine, which gave him time to map the chamber's dimensions, identify its exits, locate the 2 concealed guard positions that were occupied by individuals in black who moved with the specific economy of people who had been trained to be invisible and were very good at it, and find a 3rd concealed position that was occupied by no one and that his analysis is determined had been designed as an observation point. He occupied it. He waited. Palpatine arrived precisely at midnight, and the thing that Corax noted first was the change. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden revelation of a hidden self, a relaxation. The specific quality of a mask lowering, not because someone was finished performing, but because the audience had changed to one that required a different performance. The warmth disappeared, not replaced by coldness exactly, replaced by something that had never been either warm or cold because those categories had no application to it. Efficiency, pure operational efficiency. The expression of someone for whom other people had only ever been variables in a calculation. He spoke to the room, not to the concealed guards. He was aware of them but did not acknowledge them, which told Corax they were operational assets rather than trusted collaborators. He spoke to the room the way someone speaks to a thing they have built, and that they expect to respond. What he said was in the same encrypted language that the signal network used. Corax had the decryption keys from Lion's analysis. The Primarchs are settling, Palpatine said, establishing territory. They are behaving as a legitimate polity rather than an invasion force. This is consistent with the profile. They believe in civilization. They will attempt to build rather than conquer. He paused, listening to something that wasn't audible. Yes, he said. The War Master received the message. No response. This is expected. A longer pause. The one called Corax has been monitoring me for 11 days. He is skilled. He believes he is undetected. He is not as undetected as he believes, but he is more skilled than I expected. I recommend increasing the priority assigned to him. Corax, in the observation position, remained perfectly still. The Anakin situation is developing naturally, Palpatine continued. The bond with the War Master is a complication. They are too similar for comfort, both charismatic, both emotionally accessible, both capable of inspiring loyalty through genuine connection rather than manipulation. A pause. The War Master has not been corrupted by his situation. The alternative approaches must be prepared. He listened again. Vader, he said, and his tone changed in a way that Corax filed carefully, not the operational efficiency. Something closer to calculation laced with the specific quality of someone assessing an asset they did not fully control. Vader's stability has been compromised since arrival. He recognizes the War Master. He recognizes Skywalker. The emotional resonance is destabilizing his programming. A pause. Programming. Poor choice of word. His conditioning. He walked to the chamber's center. It does not matter, he said. The 3-sided engagement will proceed as planned. The diplomatic relationship between the Republic and Imperium Tertius cannot be allowed to stabilize. Stable alliances produce shared intelligence. Shared intelligence produces investigation. Investigation produces. He stopped. He turned. He looked directly at Corax's concealed position.
You may come out. You have heard enough. Whether you leave this chamber is a separate question.
Corax came out, not because he had been cornered. He had planned multiple exits, but because the information he had already gathered was sufficient for Guilliman's purposes. And leaving now meant losing the chance to assess Palpatine directly in a context where the mask was partially lowered. He stepped into the chamber's light. They regarded each other. Corvus Corax, Palpatine said, the Raven Lord, the one who teaches his children to be shadows. He smiled, and the smile had no warmth in it, because warmth was not the performance this room required. I have read everything your civilization's records that came through the fracture contain about you, considerably less than the others. You prefer not to be known, and I have spent 11 days learning you, Korax said. I would say you prefer to be known incorrectly. Elegant, Palpatine acknowledged. Tell me, what did you learn in 11 days? That you built this war, Korax said. Both sides. That the Clone Wars are not a conflict with a cause. They are a manufactured crisis designed to justify whatever resolution you have already planned. He paused. That you attempted to reach Horus through channels you believed were untraceable, for reasons that will require more time to fully understand. That you are aware of the warp, not as we understand it, but as something adjacent to what you call the dark side, something you have been attempting to access or weaponize or both. And what will you do with this information? Palpatine asked. Give it to Guilliman, Korax said. Who will give it to the Jedi Council? Who will begin the process of verifying it through their own channels, which will produce results sufficient to act on? Sufficient to act on, Palpatine repeated. He seemed to consider this. And if I told you that acting on it would trigger a cascade of events that produces worse outcomes than the present situation, I would say that is exactly what someone in your position would say to someone in mine, Korax replied, and that the argument's convenience does not recommend it. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. You are going to leave this chamber, he said. I want you to understand why. Because you need me to deliver the information, Korax said. Because a controlled revelation produces less damage than an uncontrolled one. Because if Guilliman and the Jedi Council believe they discovered your nature through their own investigation, they will act on it more confidently than if I simply told them and they had to trust my account. He looked at Palpatine steadily. And because having me leave with partial information is more useful to you than having me leave with complete information. Whatever I did not hear in this room, whatever you were careful not to say, that is the part you want to protect. Something shifted in Palpatine's expression. Not anger. Something closer to the specific quality of encountering an intelligence that met one's own in a way that was simultaneously satisfying and inconvenient. Go, he said. Give Guilliman what you have. Tell him I said hello. I will not tell him you said hello, Korax replied. Because that would be exactly the kind of theatrical gesture designed to make him uncertain about what the encounter means, and I prefer not to do your work for you. He left the chamber. Behind him, in the dark, Palpatine stood in the center of the geometric patterns, and felt something he had not felt in considerable time, the specific interest that came from encountering a problem he had not anticipated. Vader arrived in the Outer Rim system that Imperium Tertius had designated as a meeting point for joint operations coordination, on a ship that made no attempt at concealment and broadcast no identification, at exactly the time that the system's sensor network would have the least coverage, not because he was hiding, because he was making a point. The point was that he had studied their sensor coverage patterns in the 17 hours since receiving intelligence about this meeting's location, had identified the coverage gap and had arrived through it without difficulty. He wanted the people in this system to understand that whatever security architecture they had built in the 5 weeks since their arrival was insufficient, not as a threat, as information. He boarded the Ultramarine's vessel under escort that he tolerated with the specific quality of someone who understood the escort's function, was theatrical reassurance rather than practical restraint. They brought him to a conference room. 3 Primarchs were waiting. Guilliman, who assessed him with the systematic precision of someone reading a military briefing. Roboute, who went very still in the specific way of someone recalibrating their threat assessment in real time. And Horus Lupercal, who looked at him and did something that Vader had not experienced from anyone in the Galactic Empire. He looked at Vader like he was a person, not a threat to be evaluated, not a power to be assessed. A person, specifically, who was carrying something heavy, and who had been carrying it alone for longer than was survivable without permanent damage. Vader had not been looked at that way since Padme. He did not allow this to show. He had spent 19 years building the architecture that prevented things from showing, and the architecture held, but it held with an effort it had not required in 19 years. and the effort was itself information that he filed and examined when there was room to examine it. "Lord Vader," Guilliman said, "you requested this meeting. I came to deliver information," Vader said, "about Sidious, about his plans for your people specifically." "You serve Sidious," Dorn said. "Why would you betray his plans?" "I serve the Emperor," Vader said. "Or I did. The Emperor is dead." A pause. "I am here because in this galaxy, in this time before the war I know, I have choices that I did not have when that galaxy and that time were the ones I inhabited." He looked at Horus directly. "And because certain people in this system are in danger that they do not yet understand from a source that will not approach them directly." "You mean me," Horus said. "Not a question." "I mean you," Vader confirmed, "and Anakin Skywalker. Sidious will not move on you simultaneously. He requires one of you compromised before he approaches the other. He will attempt to turn you first, because your legend is larger and your legion is more numerous. If he succeeds, Skywalker follows. If he fails with you, he will accelerate his timeline with Skywalker." "How do you know his methodology so precisely?" Guilliman asked. Vader was quiet for 4 seconds. "Because," he said, "I am the proof of its effectiveness." The conference room absorbed this. "You are from this galaxy's future," Guilliman said. It was not a question either. He had assembled sufficient data. "An alternate future," Vader said. "One that will not be yours unless certain things happen in sequence. Things Sidious is attempting to engineer." He looked at his hands for a moment, which was a gesture that contained more information than anything he had yet said. "He will find someone Horus loves. He will create a situation where Horus must choose between saving that person and maintaining his principles. He will frame the choice so that any middle path seems unavailable." He looked up. "The choice is never as binary as it is framed, but it feels binary in the moment. That is the mechanism." "You speak with the authority of experience," Horus said quietly. "Yes," Vader said. "Then." Horus paused, and what happened in the pause was visible to everyone in the room, and was the kind of thing that Rogal Dorn, who was not known for emotional sensitivity, would remember for the rest of his life. "Then you know how it ends." "In my timeline," Vader said, "yes, and in this one, that," Vader said, "is why I am here." Anakin Skywalker encountered Darth Vader for the first time 3 days later in a corridor aboard the Republic cruiser Negotiator, and the encounter was not planned by anyone. Vader was there because Guilliman had arranged for him to be in that system, advising on Sidious's tactical methodology. Anakin was there because his mission had returned him to the Negotiator ahead of schedule after a separatist ambush that had been intended to go worse than it had. They were in the same corridor because the Negotiator's layout was inefficient in ways that the Republic's naval architects had never addressed. And the route from the hangar to the bridge passed through a section that was also the route from the temporary quarters assigned to Vader to the briefing room where he was expected. They came around the same corner from opposite directions and stopped. The Force was not subtle about what it did in that moment. Later, Ahsoka would describe it as feeling like a string being plucked, a note that resonated between 2 specific points and nowhere else, carrying information that she could sense the shape of, but not the content. What she could sense clearly was its emotional register. Grief, enormous and structured like a building that had been standing long enough to develop load-bearing walls made entirely of pain. Recognition. The specific recognition of something that should not be recognizable. And underneath both, something that frightened her because she could not name it, and that she would spend several weeks understanding, was the feeling of a future that had not happened, yet being recognized by a past that had not yet become it. Vader looked at Anakin Skywalker. Anakin looked at Vader. The armor, the respirator, rhythmic in the corridor's silence. The height, the presence, the way he occupied space with the quality of something that had learned to keep everything it was behind walls, because what it was had become too large and too painful to exist uncontained in ordinary environments. Anakin felt the Force pushing information at him that he did not want. "Who are you?" he asked, because asking made it real, and real things could be assessed, and he needed something to assess. Vader said nothing for 7 seconds. "I am a warning," he said finally, "about what happens when good intentions are weaponized by someone patient enough to wait for the right moment." He walked past Anakin. Anakin turned and watched him go, and the Force was still doing the thing with the note, still resonating between the two of them across the corridor's distance. And Ahsoka's hand closed around his arm because she had felt it too. And because she knew Anakin well enough to know that when the Force pushed information he didn't want, the thing that stopped him from closing himself off to it was being anchored by someone who was staying. "Sky Guy," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "You don't know," she said. "Not yet. But you felt it."
Yes. What did you feel?
Anakin watched Vader turn the corner and disappear. "Myself," he said. "But wrong. Like a reflection in water that's been sitting still too long." Ahsoka felt the note in the Force resolve into something that was not music and not language, but that carried the specific quality of a warning she was not yet equipped to understand. She understood it 3 days later. She understood it when Vader's armor was damaged in the engagement above Mandalore, and the respirator was briefly compromised. And she heard him make a sound, not mechanical, biological, the specific sound of someone breathing through pain. And the Force took that sound and showed her what it meant. She sat down on the deck of the hangar where she was standing and did not move for several minutes. Then she found Guilliman. She told him everything in 40 minutes, which was the time it took to say it completely, and the time it took Guilliman to process it fully. He asked 3 questions during those 40 minutes, all precise, all aimed at confirming specific data points rather than expressing reaction. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment.
"Does Horus know?"
he asked. "I don't think Vader told him everything," Ahsoka said. "He told him enough to be useful, but I don't think he told him this." "No," Guilliman agreed. "He would not have." He was silent again. "Ahsoka Tano, I am going to ask you a question that has no good answer, and I want you to understand that I am asking because the answer will determine how we proceed, not because expect a resolution to the impossibility it contains." She met his eyes. "Ask." "If the timeline in which Vader exists is the one we are trying to prevent," Guilliman said, "then Vader's presence here is the presence of someone who has failed by the people around him at the moment when failure was most consequential." He paused. "We have that person standing in front of us now, 19 years before the failure occurs. We have the opportunity to do something different." "Yes," Ahsoka said. "My question," Guilliman said, is the Anakin Skywalker in this timeline the same person as the one who became Vader? Not in his choices, in his nature. Is the underlying person, absent the specific circumstances and specific manipulations, someone for whom a different outcome is possible?" Ahsoka thought about the 4 years she had known Anakin Skywalker, about his anger and his compassion and his impatience and his loyalty, and his capacity to love things so completely that the love became a vulnerability, and his awareness of this, and his inability to resolve the tension between loving and the Jedi doctrine that told him love was dangerous. "Yes," she said, "he's someone for whom a different outcome is possible, but only if the manipulation never gets the foothold it needs. Then," Guilliman said, "we need to ensure it doesn't." He turned to the viewport, to the galaxy beyond it. "Tell Horus all of it. He needs to understand what Sidious is capable of before Sidious's next approach." "It will hurt him," Ahsoka said, "to know what he could become." "Yes," Guilliman said, but it will hurt him less than becoming it." He was right. He was, Ahsoka would understand years later, almost always right about these things. About the specific calculation of what hurt less in the long term, even when it hurt more immediately. It was his gift and his burden, the ability to see far enough ahead that the immediate pain of a decision was always visible against the background of what the alternative cost. Horus received the information that evening. He sat with it for 3 hours. Then, he found Roboute Dorn, who was working in the tactical room, because Dorn worked when he was processing difficult things, and sat across from him and said nothing for 11 minutes, which was enough time for Dorn to understand that something significant had happened. "Tell me," Dorn said, Horus told him. Dorn listened. He was not a man known for visible emotional responses. But when Horus finished, Dorn set down the datapad he had been holding and looked at the table between them for a long moment. "You are not him," Dorn said finally. "Not yet," Horus said. "Not ever," Dorn said, "because you know, and because we know, and because," he paused, searching for the articulation, "because the specific conditions that created the outcome Vader represents include an isolation that I intend to make impossible." You will not be alone when the approach comes, and I suspect you will not be the only one who ensures that." Horus looked at him.
"You are going to be very tiresome about this."
"Extremely," Dorn confirmed irritatingly, without any apology. "For as long as necessary." Something crossed Horus's face that was not quite a smile but occupied its general territory. "Good," he said. The battle above Mandalore began as 3 separate conflicts, and became one catastrophe so gradually that no single commander could identify the precise moment when salvageable became irreversible. The first conflict was Sidious's. He had spent 8 weeks building toward this engagement, with the patient architecture of someone who understood that the most effective battles were won before they began. In the selection of terrain and timing, and the careful arrangement of which forces would be where when the first shot was fired. He had chosen Mandalore because it was simultaneously strategically significant, politically contested, and emotionally loaded in ways that the newly arrived Primarchs could fully appreciate, but that every Republic and Separatist commander understood at a level below rational calculation. He had arranged for 3 of his new Justice Fleet elements to arrive on a schedule that would place them in the system at the precise moment when the Republic Imperium joint force was most committed to the engagement they had planned and least positioned to respond to a flank. He had arranged for a signal to reach Anakin Skywalker 40 minutes before the engagement began. A signal that appeared to come from Padme Amidala, from coordinates in the system's lower orbit, describing a situation of immediate danger. The signal was a fabrication. Padme was not in the system. She did not know the signal had been sent. Sidious had understood since studying the Vader intelligence that Anakin Skywalker's specific vulnerability was not the Jedi prohibition on attachment in the abstract. It was the particular person. The person who made the attachment a concrete reality rather than a philosophical position. Remove Skywalker from the primary engagement by sending him toward those coordinates, and the Republic Imperium coordination lost its most effective individual combatant at the moment when individual effectiveness mattered most. Then, with coordination degraded and forces divided, the new Justice Fleet emerged. This was the first conflict. The second conflict was the one that Dooku had not planned. He had been in the Mandalore system because the Mandalorian situation had been one of the CS's primary objectives before the arrival of the Primarchs had reorganized his priorities. And he was still working through what those reorganized priorities meant. He had spent 8 weeks watching the Primarchs establish Imperium Tertius with the specific attention of someone who was reassessing foundational assumptions about political organizations were capable of. What he had observed had disturbed him profoundly. Roboute Guilliman administered territory the way that Dooku had believed, in his most optimistic pre-Sith moments, that administration should work, with explicit attention to civilian welfare, with legal structures that constrained military authority rather than serving it, with the kind of transparent institutional design that the Republic had theoretically embodied and practically abandoned over centuries of corruption. It was not perfect. The Primarchs were products of a war-making civilization, and the marks of that showed in 10,000 decisions. But it was genuine. Guilliman genuinely believed in civilization. Dorn genuinely believed in law. Vulcan genuinely believed in the protection of the vulnerable as a primary military objective rather than a secondary consideration. Dooku had believed in these things once. He had stopped believing in them, not because they were wrong, but because he had concluded that the Republic's version of them was a facade, and that the facade had done more damage than an honest authoritarianism would have done. The Primarchs were showing him something he had not considered, that the facade was not inherent to the project. That civilization actually functioning was not an impossibility invented by naive people who hadn't seen enough of the world. He had been sitting with this for 6 weeks when Korax found him. Not dramatically, not with a team or a reveal, or the specific theatrical quality that intelligence operatives sometimes brought to these moments. Korax simply appeared in the room where Dooku was working because Korax appeared in rooms when he chose to appear in them, and the architectural barriers between him and the rooms were a practical problem rather than a genuine obstacle. "Count Dooku," Korax said, "I would like to have a conversation about Sidious." Dooku had looked at him for a long moment. "You are the intelligence one," he said. "I am one of several," Corax replied, sitting down without invitation in the manner of someone for whom the invitation was implicit in their presence. "But I am the one whose specific skill set makes this conversation possible without either of us ending up in someone's custody." "You're offering me something," Dooku said. "I am offering you a decision," Corax corrected. "You already know what Sidious is. You have known for longer than you have admitted to yourself. The question is what you intend to do with that knowledge." He paused. "The Sis is fracturing. Your separatist coalition is developing fault lines between the people who joined for reform and the people who joined for power. You can hold it together for perhaps another 4 months before the fracture becomes structural. After that, you lose control of the radical elements, and the radical elements do what radical elements always do." "And your offer prevents this?" Dooku asked. "My offer gives you a different set of options than the ones you currently believe you have," Corax said. "The Imperium needs allies who understand this galaxy's political architecture from the inside."
You understand it better than anyone alive.
He met Dooku's eyes steadily. "We are not asking you to betray your principles. We are asking you to consider whether your current affiliation actually serves them." Dooku had thought about Guilliman administering Ultramar with genuine attention to civilian welfare. He had thought about what Sidious's version of galactic order actually looked like when you followed its logic to the end. "I need 3 days," he said. "You have 2, Corax replied. He had used 1.5. The result of that conversation was that when the battle above Mandalore began, Dooku's CIS faction arrived not in support of the Justice Fleet, but in opposition to it, specifically targeting the new Justice Command elements with the precision of someone who had studied those elements' vulnerabilities from the inside. This was the second conflict. The third conflict was the one that changed everything. Anakin Skywalker reached the coordinates in Mandalore's lower orbit and found no signal, no Padme, no emergency requiring his presence, and the specific sick clarity of someone understanding that they have been moved by exactly the mechanism they had been warned about. He turned his fighter around. He was 12 minutes from the primary engagement zone. Darth Vader was 11 minutes from the same zone. From a different vector, having spent the battle's opening phase reviewing the tactical situation from the position Guilliman had assigned him. Observer, not participant, because his presence in the engagement itself created complications that the Alliance had not yet worked through. They arrived at the engagement's edge at almost exactly the same moment. Vader, because he had recalculated the tactical situation and determined that the new Justice Fleet's emergence represented a threat level requiring direct response. Anakin, because he had recalculated the tactical situation and reached the same conclusion, and was also underneath the tactical calculation, furious in the specific way of someone who had been manipulated by the thing they had been warned about, and who was processing that fury the only way Anakin Skywalker ever processed anything, by moving toward the problem at maximum speed. They came over the same engagement horizon. They saw each other. The Force did the thing it had been doing since the corridor aboard the Negotiator. The plucked note resonating between 2 specific points, but amplified now by proximity and adrenaline, and the context of a battle that was trying to become something worse, amplified to the point where even Vader's shielded presence could not contain it entirely. Vader made a choice. He had been making choices since arriving in this timeline that his previous self would not have been capable of making. Small ones, mostly, choices about what to say and what to withhold, about which information was useful and which would cause damage he couldn't predict, about how much of himself to allow into conversations that required him to be partially present in order to be useful. This choice was not small. "Skywalker," he said over the comm. "I know," Anakin said. "I've known since Ahsoka." He stopped, started again. "I've known for 3 days." "Then you understand why I'm here," Vader said. "I understand why the version of you that exists is here," Anakin said, with the specific quality of someone choosing words very carefully in a situation where careless words caused damage that couldn't be repaired. "I don't entirely understand why you're here, why you came to Guilliman, why you're telling us what you're telling us." "Because," Vader said, and the respirator's rhythm was audible between the words. I spent 19 years telling myself there was no alternative, that the choice I made was the only choice possible, that the circumstances were too extreme and the threat too immediate and the solution too obvious for anything except what I did. He paused. And then I arrived in a timeline where none of those things were yet true, he said. And I understood something that 19 years of telling myself a story had prevented me from understanding. What? Anakin asked. That I was wrong, Vader said. Not about the love, not about the fear, those were real, but about what they required, about whether the choice was actually binary, about whether the man who told me there was only one solution was someone whose assessment of the situation I should have trusted. Below them, the battle was developing in 3 separate directions simultaneously. Republic and Imperium forces engaging the New Justice fleet, Dooku's reformed CS targeting the New Justice command structure, and Horus coordinating from the Macragge's honor. With the specific quality of someone who had been told exactly how Sidious operated, and was applying that knowledge to everything he observed. We should be in that fight, Anakin said. Yes, Vader agreed, but Skywalker, a pause. Anakin, there is something you need to understand before we go into that engagement. Tell me. Sidious will be there, Vader said. Not in the battle, watching the battle. He does not expose himself directly. He observes and he identifies moments and he files them for later use. If we go into that engagement, he will be watching both of us, and whatever he observes will be used in whatever approach he makes next. Then we give him nothing to use, Anakin said. You cannot give him nothing to use, Vader said. You are who you are. Your strengths are visible. Your vulnerabilities are visible. He will find leverage regardless of what you show him. The question is whether, when he finds it, you have the architecture to recognize the approach and resist it. Do I? Anakin asked. You do, Vader said, because you know it's coming, because Horus knows it's coming, because Ahsoka knows it's coming, because every person in your orbit who matters has been told what to watch for. A pause. In my timeline, I was alone. The people who loved me were isolated from each other by circumstances Sidious engineered. They could not compare notes. They could not identify the pattern across their separate experiences of it. They could not pool their recognition of what was happening. He hasn't managed that here, Anakin said. No, Vader confirmed. He has not, and that is why this timeline is different. He looked at the engagement below them. Shall we? They went in together. What followed would be recorded in every historical account of the Mandalore engagement as the moment when the battle's character changed. Not because of tactical brilliance, though both of them were brilliant tactically, but because of something that the battle's observers on both sides recognized as rare. 2 people operating in complete coordination without any communication that anyone could detect. Anakin and Vader moved through the New Justice formation as if they had been fighting together for years, which in a sense they had, across decades of shared experience that existed in only one of them as memory and in the other as the potential that memory had grown from. They did not speak on comm. They did not need to. Horus watched from the Macragge's honor and experienced something that he would later describe to Guilliman as one of the strangest moments of his military career. Watching what was functionally the same person fighting alongside himself, and understanding that the same person could produce outcomes as different as these two were.
What does it feel like?
Guilliman asked when Horus described it. Like proof, Horus said, that the outcome is not predetermined. Sidious watched the battle from the observatory deck of a ship that was not in the tactical records of any faction present. He had been watching for 40 minutes when his assessment shifted. Not catastrophically. He was not a man given to catastrophic reassessments. He had built his entire operational methodology on the principle that setbacks were information, and that information was always useful. What shifted was his timeline. The Anakin manipulation had failed. Not permanently. Permanently was not a word he used for tactical failures, only for deaths. But the window he had been working toward had closed. The isolation that was necessary for the specific approach he had planned was not achievable in the current configuration. Too many people knew too much. Too many of those people were talking to each other. The Horus approach had also been complicated by the Vader complication, which he had not fully anticipated. He had anticipated Vader's emotional destabilization. He had not anticipated that Vader would choose disclosure over maintenance of the status quo. Vader in his own timeline had spent 19 years maintaining a story about the inevitability of his choices. This Vader had abandoned that story within weeks of arriving, which suggested that proximity to the pre-fall version of Anakin Skywalker had broken something in the architecture Sidious had spent decades building. That was interesting. That was also the kind of interesting that required recalibration before it became dangerous. He adjusted 3 elements of his current plan and developed contingencies for 4 more. Then he did something he rarely did because it was rarely necessary. He acknowledged that the position had shifted against him. Not decisively, not irreversibly. The galaxy was enormous and his network was extensive, and the Imperium Tertius, whatever its current trajectory, was still resource limited and politically nascent and dependent on relationships with institutions he largely controlled. But the position had shifted because something he had not included in his calculations had happened. The Primarchs were building something real. He had anticipated they would attempt to build something. He had expected what civilizations built when transplanted to new contexts without their foundational infrastructure. Something fragile, defensive, temporary, more concerned with survival than institution. Something that would make them dependent on existing power structures in ways he could leverage. What Guilliman was actually building was not that. What Guilliman was actually building was, in Sidious's careful assessment of the past 8 weeks, the closest thing to functioning governance the Republic had produced in 300 years. That was the part he had not planned for. He was still thinking about it when the Dooku CIS elements destroyed his new Justice Command ship's long-range communication array, and the battle above Mandalore reached its conclusion. They gathered in the aftermath with the exhausted quality of people who had survived something and not yet processed whether surviving it constituted a victory. The conference room of the Macrag's Honor held more people than it had been designed for comfortably. Guilliman, Horus, Dorn, Corax, and Lion at the Primarch end. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Ahsoka Tano, and Bail Organa representing the Republic-aligned forces. Dooku, whose presence created a specific quality of discomfort that no one fully addressed, because the battle had demonstrated his reliability in terms more concrete than any political assurance could have. And Vader, standing apart from the main group in the manner he had maintained since his arrival, present but peripheral, participant but not integral. Status, Guilliman said. The reports came in sequence. The new Justice Fleet had retreated with significant losses, its command structure targeted with precision by Dooku's forces before it could execute the second phase of its operational plan. The Republic Imperium Joint Force had held its position without catastrophic casualties. The engagement had been a tactical success for the Alliance and a strategic setback for Sidious. He will adapt, Corax said when the reports concluded. He has already adapted. His timeline has shifted, but his objective has not changed. What is his objective? Dooku asked, with the specific quality of someone who had spent years in Sidious's confidence and was reassessing every conversation in that context. Order, Obi-Wan said, his specific version of it. Absolute authority consolidated in a single intelligence, unconstrained by democratic institutions or legal limits, sustained through a combination of genuine capability and carefully manufactured fear. I believed something similar once, Dooku said. I know, Obi-Wan said, not unkindly. The difference, Dooku continued, is that I believed the existing institutions were too corrupt to be reformed, that the replacement needed to be built outside them. He looked at Guilliman. You are building something. I have been watching for 8 weeks. You are building it inside the existing structures, using them as scaffold while constructing the actual architecture alongside. The existing structures represent thousands of years of institutional knowledge, Guilliman said. Even corrupted institutions carry information about what the uncorrupted version attempted to be. Discarding them entirely means losing that accumulated attempt. He paused. Besides, a slight change in his expression that on someone with less control would have been wry. The people who live within those structures deserve to be part of their own rebuilding. Government imposed from outside, however well-intentioned, tends to produce the thing we are trying to prevent. Dooku was quiet for a moment. I came to a different conclusion. Yes, Guilliman said, and I do not think your conclusion was reached without sufficient evidence for it. The Republic has been failing its citizens in documented ways for a very long time. He met Dooku's eyes. But I think you were offered a solution by someone who understood what solution you were primed to accept. Sidious offered me revolution, Dooku said. I accepted because revolution was what I had concluded was necessary, and instead, Organa started. And instead, he was manufacturing the conditions that made revolution seem necessary. Dooku finished, while ensuring that the revolution, when it came, served his ends rather than mine. He looked at his hands for a moment. I am not unaware of the irony. A man who spent his career identifying political manipulation became its instrument. You are not the first, Vader said, from where he stood apart from the group. He spoke without drama, without emphasis, with the flat quality of someone making a factual observation. And the recognition, he paused. The recognition means something, even when it comes late. The room looked at him. He did not elaborate. Anakin, across the room, watched him and said nothing. What passed between them in that silence was not visible to anyone else in the room. But Ahsoka, who was watching both of them, felt it in the Force as a resolving chord. Not resolution, not peace, but the specific quality of two versions of the same grief finally occupying the same space and being for the first time witnessed by each other. We need a coordinated strategy, Horus said, returning the room to operational ground because the emotional territory was real, but the immediate situation was more urgent. Sidious will recalibrate. He has resources we have not fully mapped. He has time and patience and a political position that gives him access to institutional power we cannot match directly. We do not need to match it directly, Korax said.
We need to make his network visible, not to us.
We already know what it is. Visible to the galaxy, to the Senate, to the systems that currently operate within his institutional reach, without understanding what they are operating within. A disclosure operation, Organa said. A disclosure operation, Korax confirmed, everything we have. Signal intercepts, financial flows, command structure analyses, Dooku's first-hand testimony. Everything that documents what the manufactured crisis actually is and who manufactured it. He will deny it, Kenobi said. Of course he will deny it, Korax replied. People deny things when the evidence is insufficient to prevent denial from being effective. The question is whether the evidence we have crosses the threshold where denial becomes more damaging than acknowledgement. Does it? Dorn asked. Korax considered. Not yet. We need 3 more elements. First, a corroborating source that cannot be dismissed as Imperium propaganda or separatist revisionism. Something from within the Republic's own structure. I can provide that, Organa said. There are Senate records I have been holding for 2 years, waiting for a moment when releasing them would not simply result in my disappearance. Second, Korax continued, we need the Jedi Council's formal declaration, not a suspicion, a conclusion. The Jedi's credibility with ordinary Republic citizens remains significant despite Sidious's efforts to undermine it. A formal council declaration that Sidious is operating a Sith agenda from the Chancellorship will be the most significant political event in the Republic's history. Mace Windu said from the doorway. Everyone turned. He had arrived without announcement, which suggested he had been aboard the Macrag's Honor for longer than his entrance implied. Master Windu, Kenobi said. I heard the tactical summary, Windu said, walking into the room. He looked at Vader for a long moment, then at Anakin, then at Guilliman. I also heard the analysis, and I have spent 6 hours in communication with the rest of the council. He looked at Korax. You said 3 elements. What is the third? Timing, Korax said. Reshape without operational preparation gives him time to execute countermeasures. We need the disclosure and the operational response to land simultaneously, which means coordinating a political action and a military action on the same trigger. Can it be done? Horus asked. It can be done, Korax said. But it requires everyone in this room to hold their current positions and continue operating as though the disclosure operation does not exist. Because if he detects preparation, he accelerates. How long? Dorn asked. 3 weeks, Korax said. Possibly 2. The room absorbed this. Then, Guilliman said, "We have a plan." The disclosure operation executed on a Tuesday morning in Galactic Standard Time, which Corax had elected because Tuesdays were statistically the least monitored days in Senate communication traffic, and because the specific administrative cycle of Republic government meant that Tuesday disclosures had the largest institutional surface area to propagate across before any single office could contain them. It worked precisely as designed and produced consequences significantly larger than designed, because designed consequences always underestimated how much accumulated pressure had been waiting for the specific key that would release it. Sheev Palpatine's Senate session that Tuesday was interrupted 40 minutes in by a data broadcast that reached every communication terminal on Coruscant simultaneously, transmitted from 17 separate relay points that had been converted from Sidious's zone network by Corax's team over the previous 10 days. The broadcast contained 11 hours of documentation. Palpatine's response was masterful, controlled, measured, the specific performance of a man who was being falsely accused, and who understood that how he responded to false accusation was more important than the accusation's content. He requested a formal Senate investigation. He submitted himself to Jedi oversight. He issued a statement expressing his profound concern that this fabricated attack on his character represented exactly the kind of destabilization that separatist extremists and unknown extragalactic forces were attempting to achieve. It was, by any technical measure, an excellent response. It was insufficient, because the Jedi Council's declaration arrived 12 minutes after the broadcast, and the Jedi Council's declaration was not a suspicion or a political position. It was a conclusion reached through the Force, through 11 weeks of 11 Jedi Masters, applying the most sophisticated truth detection framework in galactic history to a question they had approached with rigorous epistemic caution. The conclusion was brief. The entity presenting as Sheev Palpatine is a Sith Lord. His political position was achieved through deliberate manipulation of galactic events, including the engineering of the Clone Wars. The Jedi Order calls upon the Senate to suspend the emergency powers granted to the Chancellorship, pending a full investigation and the removal of the individual currently holding that position from all government functions. It was signed by all 11 members of the Council. It was, in the estimation of everyone who had been present in the conference room, of the Macrag's honor. 3 weeks earlier, still not enough to produce the outcome they needed. Sidious had too many committed allies, too many compromised institutions, too much entrenched power. What made it enough was the thing they had not planned. Dooku stood in the Senate chamber during the session that was called to respond to the broadcast and the Council declaration, and he spoke for 23 minutes, without notes, without preparation, without any of the political calculation that had characterized his public career for 30 years. He spoke about what he had believed and why he had believed it, about the Republic's genuine failures and genuine corruption, about being shown a solution and accepting it without sufficiently examining who was offering it and why, about 30 years of working within Sidious's network without understanding that the network's purpose was the opposite of the purpose he had been told it served. He spoke with the specific quality of someone who was destroying their own legacy in real time and had decided that the destruction was necessary and correct. When he finished, the Senate chamber was quiet for 11 seconds. Then it was not quiet. The investigation that followed lasted 4 months and produced outcomes that no faction had fully predicted, because the disclosure of Sidious's network revealed entanglements so extensive that the cleanup of the Republic's institutional structure became a generational project rather than a political event. Sidious himself was not immediately captured. He did what he always did when a position became untenable. He withdrew, calculated, and began preparing the next move. He was not eliminated. He was contained, exposed, and forced into a posture of response rather than initiative. That was not the end of him, but it was the end of the particular game he had been playing. Imperium Tertius established formal diplomatic relations with 17 Republic systems in the year following Mandalore, negotiated through Guilliman's office with the patient institutional rigor that was his defining characteristic. Horus commanded joint operations against separatist radical elements for 8 months before the reformed Siduku's CS, as it had been informally renamed, declared a formal ceasefire that held through the subsequent peace negotiations. Corax's intelligence network expanded through cooperation with Organa, Ahsoka, and a gradually growing roster of Republic operatives who understood what the network was doing and chose to participate in it. Continued mapping Sidious's surviving infrastructure with the specific long-term patience that large-scale dismantling operations required. Vader remained, not integrated into any operational structure, not public. He occupied the specific position of someone whose existence created diplomatic complications that no one had yet developed a framework for addressing, and who understood that this was probably permanent, and had decided that permanent complication was acceptable if the alternative was absence. Anakin visited him occasionally. The conversations were not easy. They were not supposed to be easy. They were the specific conversations that happened between two people, when one of them was a possible future, and the other was the present that the future was trying to not become. And those conversations did not have a format that made them comfortable, but they happened. And in the Force, something that Ahsoka described and Yoda confirmed and Obi-Wan understood without being able to articulate, each conversation produced a small but measurable shift in the pattern. The plucked note becoming less a warning and more a resolution, less a resonance between two versions of the same tragedy, and more a genuine dialogue between two separate people who shared something important. The warp signal was detected on a Thursday, not Corax's network, not Republic sensors. The Ultramarine's long-range array, calibrated for signatures that had no analog in this galaxy's detection framework, received a signal from beyond the galactic edge that their analysts identified in 3 hours and confirmed in 8, and brought to Guilliman in the manner of people delivering information they wished they could continue not knowing. It was not chaos. It was something that their records associated with chaos in the way that the presence of smoke was associated with fire, adjacent, indicative, a symptom of a cause that was still distant. Something had noticed the dimensional fracture. Something very large, with the specific patience of things that operated on timescales where galactic distances were not significant barriers, had detected the intersection of a Force-governed galaxy and a warp-adjacent civilization, and had begun the particular kind of slow, deliberate movement that suggested it was not in a hurry because it did not need to be. Guilliman looked at the data for a long time. Then he called a meeting. Not the emergency meeting that the data technically warranted. Not yet. The meeting where he assembled the people who needed to understand what was coming and began the specific long-term planning that his nature required him to begin immediately. Because the worst possible response to a vast and patient threat was to wait until it was proximate. "We have time," he said, to the assembled faces around the table. Horus, Dorn, Lion, Corax, Vulcan, Mortarion, Fulgrogram, Kenobi, Windu, Ahsoka, Organa, Dooku, and Vader, the impossible coalition that this galaxy had somehow produced from the collision of everything it was and everything the Imperium had been trying to become. "We have time," he said again, "which means we have the opportunity to be ready in ways that we were not ready before, to build the thing that we have been building more completely, before the thing coming requires us to defend it." He looked around the table. "We came here without knowing why," he said, "without understanding what the fracture was or what it was for. We have spent months determining that Sidious caused it accidentally, while trying to access power he didn't understand." He paused. "But the Force does not operate through accident in the same way that physics does." The Force moved sideways, toward us. "The Force brought us here." Yoda, who had been present but silent throughout the briefing, opened his eyes. "Why us?" he asked. "Ask the right question, Guilliman does. Answer it. The Force has not given us directly, given us only the situation. Decide the meaning for ourselves, we must." Guilliman looked at the signal data, at the galactic edge, at the space beyond it where something patient and enormous was beginning to move. "Then," he said quietly, "let us build something worth defending, before we have to defend it." Outside the flagship's viewports, the galaxy continued its ancient business. Stars burning, systems orbiting, civilizations living and dying and hoping at scales that dwarfed any individual decision. And at the edge of all of it, in the dark beyond the last star, something that had consumed civilizations across geological time began the long approach. It had been following the dimensional fractures trail. It had found the intersection of two cosmologies, and in the vast and patient calculus of its hunger, it calculated that what waited at the journey's end was worth the trip.
I'm honestly still processing that ending. That final shift in the threat level, absolute nightmare fuel. If you love this deep dive into the Imperium's new reality, make sure to hit that sub button. I've already got a follow-up theory on what that patient threat at the edge of the galaxy actually is. Before you go, I have to know, who do you think would actually win? In a full-scale war, the Jedi Council or the Primarchs? Drop your verdict in the comments. Thanks for watching, and keep looking at the stars.